We want to thank everyone for joining us today for the session on the outlook for Global LNG. My name is Steve Davis, a senior energy partner in the Houston office of Aiken Gump. I've been involved in the natural gas and LNG industry for a large portion of my 35-plus year legal career and as an engineer before that. Before we continue, a few housekeeping items. The audience is on mute to prevent any background noise. We will host a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. Please submit your questions through the chat box feature throughout the presentation. We would like to direct your attention to the reminder email we circulated 2 hours prior to the webinar. For those seeking CLE credit, please follow the instructions in the email. Today's CLE affirmation code is AG0521. I repeat, AG0521. Also included in that reminder email are links to alerts and blog posts that are relevant to the topics we will be discussing today. There are also links to complete bios of today's speakers. Finally, please note that media are welcome to attend this webinar, but the content discussed is strictly off the record. We're very pleased to be doing a joint presentation today with Gaffney Klein, an international petroleum consultancy which has been operating worldwide since 1962. Specializes in the provision of policy, strategy, technical, and commercial assistance to entities involved in all sectors of the oil and gas industry. Let's spend some time today exploring the LNG industry and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. First, let me introduce our speakers. Nick Fulford is Global Head of Gas and LNG for Gaffney Klein with over 35 years of experience in the natural gas sector, working on all aspects of the gas value chain. Ashish Mohanty is Principal Americas Gas and LNG with Gaffney Klein and has two decades of experience across the global gas and LNG industry. Michael Joyce is a partner in the Aiken Gump Singapore office and leads the firm's energy practice in Asia. And Gabe Procaccini is a partner in Aiken Gump's Houston office and advises LNG and regasified LNG project developers, traders, producers, and midstream companies on transactions along the entire value chain. So now let's jump into some questions. Nick, I know at Gaffney Klein you follow the gas market very closely, both here in the U.S. and globally. What do you make of the current situation for natural gas?
Well, thanks very much, Steve. And I also wanted to say how much we appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with Aiken Gump on today's event. As you mentioned, Steve, it couldn't really be more timely. So to put things in very simple terms, the same things that have allowed the virus to spread so quickly internationally, in effect, easy movement of gas in a globally interconnected market, are really the same factors that have allowed today's environment to evolve as it has. But the biggest catalyst by far for the globalization has been the emergence of the U.S., not simply as an LNG exporter, but really an exporter on the same scale that already rivals the other two dominant producers, obviously Qatar and Australia. But before delving into today's situation more closely, I just wanted to add in a good dose of optimism, really optimism and confidence in a return to stability for gas markets and investments globally. Natural gas still is the fastest growing fossil fuel, which is set to play a pivotal role, really, in the energy transition over the next several decades. And it's worth bearing in mind that even the most aggressive decarbonization scenarios envisage over $300 billion of investment in gas every year. Now, of course, natural gas investments typically play out over not years, but in fact decades. And in that context, almost everything, as Steve and I will talk about today, is just really a difficult chapter for a commodity that will be a very meaningful driver for economic growth, prosperity, and the transition to a sustainable future. So with that, let's take a look at what's been happening. Well, the price history speaks for itself, really. The fact is that global gas has been in trouble for some time. Now, obviously, it depends very much on your viewpoint. It's been a great outcome if you're a gas or an electricity consumer, but most certainly if you're trying to produce and sell gas at a level that will provide a return on your sunk cost and infrastructure, the last 2 years has been really hard. The point at which supply started to noticeably exceed demand was around the start of 2019, when what should have been the start of the winter heating season actually turned into a worrying price decline, at least for index-based gas. Before that, both oil-indexed and gas-linked contracts have been running at comparable levels, with buyers on the fence about which way to go with their new contracts and pricing formulae. Now, I know quite a few people on today's call will have a good familiarity with gas pricing, but it's worth mentioning, of course, that the majority of LNG in today's market continues to be traded on traditional oil-linked take-or-pay type arrangements. And one of the big questions in the post-COVID world is really how much longer that will last. As you can see, for most of 2019, gas-indexed LNG was running well below oil price cargoes, and this has already created some tension around price reopeners and volume renegotiations. So to put this into context, which I like to do, is it brings a real kind of reality to things. This means that for the most of last year, you might be expected to pay around $30 million for a single shipload of LNG priced against an oil index, but only $20 million for a cargo purchased outside a long-term deal. Now, that's a huge saving that drives the way in which buyers are going to approach their SPA discussions. So let's take a step back and summarize for a moment. From the beginning of 2019, market clearing prices for gas more or less halved from, let's say, around $9 to $10 to between $4 and $5 an MMBTU. And then the last 3 months, they've halved again, with Asian and European prices at record low levels, both now less than $2 per MMBTU, and almost unbelievably at times lower than Henry Hub in the last couple of weeks. For most of 2019, Europe became really the market of last resort for LNG production globally. These last few weeks, however, Europe's ability to soak up the gas has reached its limit, and that flexibility is more or less used up, especially as we come out of the heating season. Even the physical limitations around storage of gas are becoming a concern. On the export side, that's going to start leading to turn down or even turning off some of the liquefaction trains around the world. And of course, that will very quickly crystallize some of the very large financial liabilities. So with these pricing dynamics now, we're starting to work their way through into the market. We're now seeing some quite significant responses from LNG sellers all over the world, but particularly in the US. So with that, I'll hand over to Ashish. So how do you think the sudden lowering in LNG demand has impacted production, and who do you think will be most impacted by it?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for listening in. Thanks for the question, Nick. As supply gets pushed back from the markets, what then are the options that LNG suppliers really have? For quite some time now, as you mentioned, Europe has been the market of last resort, with its storage absorbing the excess. However, that door is gradually getting shut as the storage fills up. While production cuts by Norway and Russia and the nuclear outages in France have provided some relief, they're not expected to be enough, especially as we enter the lean summer period. As LNG piles up at the liquefaction terminals, there is imminent danger of tank tops suffering. To avoid such situations and to, of course, buy some more time, a number of LNG projects and suppliers have been adopting the floating cargo or even a wandering cargo strategy, whereby the LNG ships slow steam as they travel to their destinations, or even wander around quite a bit as the companies try to find an available destination for them. This does not come without cost, as the boil-off in LNG ships is quite a bit higher than in onshore tanks. Finally, of course, it's time to consider curtailments or shut-ins of production. An obvious mitigation in this scenario is bringing forward the annual or major maintenances as relevant. Quite a few projects have already announced them. However, there's only so much that they can help. On your question about who have been most impacted by it, let me start with saying that as the LNG demand has lowered, we have effectively been going down the cost curve for LNG supply. And as one can see from the current pricing levels, we are looking at cargoes being produced and sold as long as they're economic on a marginal basis, that is, manage to cover the variable costs. From this perspective, it becomes quite clear why U.S. export terminals are at a distinct disadvantage. Since they're among the most distant from the major markets in Asia, the spread between Asian LNG hub prices and Henry Hub will need to cover the additional shipping costs, which even with lower charter rates currently are at least $1 or more. As you can see in this graph, that spread has disappeared completely with the convergence of global prices, making U.S. LNG uneconomic delivered either into Asia or Europe, even on a marginal basis. Hence, it comes as no surprise that a number of liftings from U.S. terminals are being cancelled. It is being heard that more than 30 cancellations have happened just for the month of June, with potentially more to come. Companies who have some obligations to supply are preferring to fulfill them by buying replacements in the spot market instead of lifting U.S. cargoes. Another characteristic worth noting about U.S. LNG is that most of the cargoes are bought on an FOB basis by the buyers and do not have a destination associated with them. Hence, it might not be straightforward for them to get contractual force majeure relief on their liftings. Every cargo cancelled costs the buyers anywhere between $7 to $9 million, as most contracts require them to pay a cancellation fee to compensate the plant owner for the fixed cost of the terminal. While strictly speaking, the terminal owner should be immune, all of us know that in long-term contracts, a situation where one of the parties continues to hurt on a regular basis is not a desirable situation. Let us hence hope that the situation gets better soon. Currently, as we get into the northern hemisphere summer, it is expected that things might actually get worse before they get better. While there has been some relief lately as lockdowns are slowly being eased in some of the major markets in Asia, and Argentina continues to buy cargoes to cover its winter requirements, one would probably have to wait at least for some more months before the U.S. cargoes start becoming economic again, even on a marginal basis. With that, back to you, Steve.
Ashish and Nick, thank you very much. That's a great overview. It is amazing how low the spot prices for LNG have gone, and that we have similar storage issues with LNG that we have with crude oil in today's market. Michael, let's turn to you. Ashish mentioned LNG there and related FM issues, force majeure issues. So what is it? What is this force majeure? And do COVID-19 related issues qualify as force majeure? And what other non-operational reliefs might be available?
Thanks, Steve, and hello, everyone. Given the level of demand destruction that has occurred, many buyers in Asia are under intense pressure, and there have been numerous reports that buyers from China, India, Korea, and elsewhere have invoked force majeure provisions to try to obtain relief from delivery and take-or-pay obligations. So what is force majeure in an LNG context? Under English law, which is the most common choice of governing law in long-term Asian LNG contracts, FM is a form of relief that is available only if and to the extent provided in the relevant contract. Therefore, much depends on the specific terms of each FM clause. Whilst there is no standard form of FM clause, generally speaking, long-term LNG contracts typically require the following elements to be satisfied. An event that has occurred that is not reasonably within the control of a party, could not have been avoided or mitigated, and which has prevented, hindered, or delayed some aspect of performance. Usually the FM clause will give a non-exhaustive list of such events, as well as a list of events that do not qualify as FM for the purposes of the contract. In claiming FM must promptly give notice of the FM event, including details of the performance that has been impacted, the expected duration of the event, and a statement of the actions being taken to resume performance. If these requirements are satisfied, then FM relief may be available to the extent that the relevant performance has been impacted. If the requesting party is the buyer, then its obligation to take LNG may be suspended for so long as the conditions for FM are satisfied, but the relief cannot go on indefinitely, and prolonged FM is often a ground for termination, for example, in circumstances where the force majeure event extends beyond a certain period and or affects more than a specified volume of LNG cargoes. Once the conditions for FM are no longer satisfied, performance under the contract is to resume. So what is an FM event? Typically, the non-exhaustive list of FM events stated in an FM clause include matters such as extreme weather events, natural disasters, civil disorders, sanctions, acts of government, changes in law. Importantly, in present circumstances, epidemics are also specified often in these clauses. But since such lists are usually non-exhaustive, the absence of such an express reference is not likely to be determinative of whether or not a claim can be made. However, the list of matters that cannot be FM events are frequently included in contracts as well, and often these include changes in the market or demand for LNG or natural gas, and events affecting customers downstream of the buyer's facilities. I should note at this point that under English law, unless specifically stated as a requirement in a clause, it has been held that there is no requirement for a force majeure event to be unforeseen by the party seeking to invoke the force majeure clause. So, once a force majeure event has been called, the clause will usually require valid notice to be served by the party seeking to claim FM. What constitutes valid notice has been addressed by the courts in some detail, and it has been held that notice must be served strictly in accordance with the wording of the contract. And even minor deviations from the contract requirements have resulted in such notices being deemed invalid. Until validly notified force majeure has been issued to the seller, a contract counterparty, the seller, if it is being called by the buyer, may treat the contract as continuing and require that the buyer continue to perform under the terms of the contract until a valid notice is given. So, does coronavirus qualify as FM? Well, it's certainly possible to envisage circumstances in which the outbreak may satisfy requirements for force majeure. For example, depending on the terms of each contract, if generally applicable government action to control the outbreak results in mandatory closure of receiving terminals, and if proper notice of FM is given and other mitigation is not possible, then it may be that FM relief could be available. However, short of that, the position is less clear. Also, as I mentioned earlier, force majeure clauses commonly exclude changes in market conditions or changes in downstream customer demand. So if a party is relying on downstream demand destruction and or lack of storage capacity due to that demand destruction, it would appear difficult for a buyer to be able to substantiate a force majeure claim on that basis alone. So then, what if force majeure isn't available? Given some of the difficulties in claiming FM, buyers also need to look at other contractual rights. Gabe will deal with some of the usual operational reliefs like DQT and so on, so I'll keep this brief. Because many national governments have passed laws in order to contain the virus, apart from FM, parties should look to see if their contracts contain a change in law clause. Change in law clauses normally provide relief where there has been a change in law which impacts, for example, the costs of performance, and, unlike force majeure, do not rely on prevention or delay in performance due to an event to respond, but rather focus on the increased costs flowing from the change in law. Claiming under them, however, is not without difficulty, as the parties need to agree what the cost impact is and how to deal with it. Some commentators have also referred to material adverse change clauses, but in my view, these types of clauses are unusual in an Asian LNG context outside of, perhaps, a foundation customer LNG contract. Also, if material adverse change clauses are in the contract, since the typical relief is termination, in a long-term LNG context, serious consideration would need to be given to invoking it, as the need for relief under the contract needs to be balanced against the longer-term need for stable supply. Thanks, Steve. I might leave it there. Back to you.
Great, Michael. Thank you. That's a very good, comprehensive set of comments there on the legal issues associated with force majeure. So, Gabe, to you now, what are some other contractual issues that you are seeing or expect that LNG participants are considering in this difficult operating environment?
Thanks, Steve, and hello, everyone. First, as discussed, we are certainly seeing parties cancel or suspend LNG cargoes. For example, Shell, Total, and BP have all canceled cargoes recently, and virtually every U.S. liquefaction facility has been on the receiving end of cancellations. It is important to point out, though, that many U.S. LNG contracts provide buyers the right, with advance notice, to cancel or suspend cargoes without penalty or liability, provided the buyer pays the cancellation or suspension fee, which in an LNG SPA generally covers liquefaction costs. So cargoes are being canceled because in most cases they can be canceled without risk of breach of contract. And the upside for the buyer is that it obtains relief from paying the full contract price. Moreover, in some cases, a buyer will obtain makeup rights on those quantities, which can be utilized in later contract years, although the obligation of a seller to actually deliver those makeup quantities often is subject to certain restrictions. And from the seller perspective, a cargo cancellation is certainly a better outcome than a buyer force majeure claim. We're also seeing increased attention on price review clauses, which are provisions that provide that the contract price will be subject to review and potential reformulation. As the JKM index has reached record lows in Asia, certain non-JKM priced LNG contracts used to ship cargoes into Asia, as mentioned earlier, have become uncompetitive. And so those contracts are especially vulnerable to price reviews where they exist. One of the key factors in exercising a price review turns on the triggers that must be satisfied. While some agreements contain mechanical triggers, which are sometimes too prescriptive to be useful right now, others contain subjective price triggers, which, given the indefinite and uncertain nature of this crisis, are viewed by some as providing greater utility. In particular focus are those provisions that are styled as a price review in name, but are really hardship clauses, such as a provision providing that the parties will revise the price in their LNG contract if over time there are movements in the market relative to the contract price which result in unforeseen hardship to the buyer or the seller, with hardship often undefined. And yet other price review provisions, no hardship needs to be alleged, and so the trigger essentially rests on proof that the contract price is now misaligned with prevailing market conditions. While some contracts are silent on the process by which price review disputes are resolved, and thus price reviews are often thought to be unenforceable agreements to agree, other contracts solve for this problem by requiring that an expert or even arbitration panel resolve the dispute. And so in those cases, attention must be given to the price adjustment methodology that will apply. In addition, we're seeing parties explore opportunities to adjust their annual LNG contract quantities through flexible quantity provisions like DQT, which, while not in every LNG SPA, allow the parties to adjust their quantity commitments without liability, although downward quantity adjustments are usually capped, for example, at 10% of the annual contract quantity, and often contain a lifetime cap, which is less than the sum of the annual allowances. Some buyers will also likely view this as a good time to cash in carry forward overtakes from prior years as credits against current obligations to the extent permitted under their contracts. For those LNG agreements with destination or diversion clauses, we expect parties to push for more flexibility. While destination clauses are generally disfavored today and restricted under certain competition laws, some LNG contracts that contain such provisions will allow buyers to divert cargoes if they experience operational issues. For example, tank tops at the relevant terminal or lower than expected demand for LNG in their domestic market. In some cases, those diversion sales require the sharing of the benefits of the incremental revenue from the alternative sale, or the seller to act as buyer's agent in the alternative sale, but the exercise of such rights can still provide net relief to the affected party. For new projects coming online now, including new regas pipeline projects, we're expecting some customers to waive late start damages that they would otherwise be entitled to claim for delayed startups and extended commissioning. Many liquefaction and regas projects have had to delay startup, whether due to EPC contractor issues, increasing difficulties in obtaining permits, and pipeline rights of way, or now due to COVID-19 constraints. But these delays have benefited customers in certain markets, and so some are actually seeking longer delays where possible. Back to you, Steve.
Gabe, thank you very much for fleshing that out. In particular, I've always found price review clauses to be difficult to implement, but they are part of the landscape. Turning now to some of the consequences of COVID-19, Ashish, how has the COVID-19 crisis impacted LNG supply projects that have been under construction?
That's a very good question, Steve. The one thing we're seeing about COVID-19 is that it knows no barriers and has indiscriminately impacted everything in its sight. So it's not surprising that while much of the focus in the LNG industry has been on demand destruction from lockdowns in the key markets, the virus is also having potentially far-reaching consequences on LNG liquefaction projects that have been constructed. Some of these projects have already been facing significant regional challenges, be it the First Nations protests against construction of pipelines that will bring gas to projects in Western Canada, or the militancy threats that have been growing in areas around the LNG projects in Mozambique. The COVID-19 crisis has now added 3 more challenges. First, of course, unfortunately, there have been several cases reported at the construction sites. At Mozambique LNG, for example, the project workers account for a majority of cases in the country. But they're not alone. Other projects have also had to restrict their activities as cases have been reported. Second, the restrictions in port activity have also significantly impacted construction as they affect both ends, the loading of equipment and modules next to the manufacturing yards, as well as offloading them at the plant sites. With a trend in recent years to make more of the LNG projects modular, the impacts are expected to be higher. Last but not least, the capital costs involved in construction of LNG liquefaction projects is an enormous burden for the investors in the current recessionary environment, when, as we know, most of them are looking at cutting back on their spending. Standalone projects are expensive to start with, but the tab gets multiplied by at least 2 to 3 times when one looks at integrated developments. While it is expected that projects constructed in the Australian way would experience delays and cost overruns due to the very greenfield nature of the developments, it caught many people by surprise that even projects in the US way experienced issues, since one of the major advantages with them was supposed to be that they were brownfield with substantial support infrastructure already in place. This proves that development of LNG liquefaction projects continue to remain complex. And with these new challenges posed by COVID-19, it is quite likely that the projects could face schedule and cost uncertainties. And hence, the tsunami of new LNG supply that is expected to flood the market by the middle of the decade could be quite a bit slower and also cause some pain. Hope this answers the question. Over to you, Steve.
Ashish, yes, it does, and thank you. The axiom that all politics is local comes to mind when you mentioned the First Nations issues and some of those in Mozambique, and then you have to add the effects of a pandemic. Gabe, let's turn back to you. How has COVID-19 impacted the U.S. upstream space, and how might that affect U.S. LNG buyers?
Steve, interest in upstream natural gas assets has been remarkably strong in 2020, with the stock prices of many pure-play gas E&Ps up over 100% since the market's March lows. And this is indeed the first time in a long time that energy has actually been an outperformer. But this gas story really starts with the crude oil markets and the abundance of associated gas in the United States arising from the increase in oil production, which has driven natural gas prices generally lower and lower for years. Now, however, due to COVID-19 oil demand destruction and the related record oil and product storage builds and drop-off in refinery demand, we're seeing a significant decline in drilling and completion activity, and even a cutback in existing production, with shut-ins underway across many U.S. oil plays. And so a tightening in U.S. natural gas supply may well be underway. And when one considers that crude oil would generally need to rebound to $50 plus per barrel on average for meaningful oil drilling activity to restart across many basins in the U.S., the outlook for a decline in U.S. natural gas supply becomes, for some, even more interesting. But a new concern for U.S. LNG participants may well be Henry Hub price exposure, particularly at a time when the global energy demand outlook continues to get revised down each week as recessions deepen in international markets, lockdowns continue to be extended, and LNG storage levels remain nearly full in Europe and certain other markets. If U.S. natural gas supply tightens and Henry Hub prices rise, and in fact, we've already seen meaningful increases in Henry Hub and regional gas hubs like Waha over the past month, while LNG markers and proxies like Brent remain at historic lows or continue to trend lower, there's a risk that U.S. LNG export transactions into many major foreign markets will be pushed further out of the money and deepen losses for those participants without a proper U.S. gas to LNG hedge. Over to you, Steve.
Gabe, thank you. Certainly in the upstream, both the oil and gas sectors are really heavily affected. So now, Nick, let's come back to you as well. What effects are you seeing on the projects that were poised for FID this year, for final investment decision this year and next?
Thanks, Steve. I think in addition to some of the financing factors that have been talked about, I think the effects have been twofold, really, which I'll develop a bit for you. But when all said and done, the result, I think, is that really any LNG FID this year seems highly unlikely, other than potentially those driven by, should we say, more geopolitical and other more strategic factors. First of all, as we look back, many of the FIDs in 2018 and 2019 benefited from equity marketing. In other words, where the LNG offtake was guaranteed by the project sponsors and the volume and price risk was passed down the chain to their respective marketing organizations. In many ways, this was a response to increasing buyer reluctance to commit to long-term takeaway, and secondly, lender reluctance to move away from their traditional models with take-or-pay terms and strong credit underpinning debt service, as we just heard. But really, in the current environment, equity marketing used to facilitate FIDs is no longer really seen as an acceptable risk, even for the big LNG players. So this feature alone, I think, will slow things down quite a bit. Secondly, for the US in particular, as we've heard, we're seeing a new, much tighter and currently really non-existent price arbitration opportunity between the feed gas priced at wholesale levels and LNG landed prices in Europe and Asia. And so as we look around the world, arguably Qatar is one of the few entities still able to take a long view, but for most LNG projects, FIDs will be put back perhaps at least a year. But you know what they say, Steve, forecasts are always wrong, so we shall see what transpires. But I'm sure you're seeing a lot of the same fallout at Akenkamp as well.
You're definitely on point with that, Nick. It is amazing as well how prolific the North Field is and how Qatar benefits from that. No question about all that. So, Michael, coming to you, in terms of consequences on future supply, what do you see in terms of LNG contracting trends at a high level going forward?
Thanks, Steve. There are two things I'd like to mention here. The first is that over the last 10 years, and in particular over the last 5 years, we've seen an increasing number of master sale and purchase agreements entered into by buyers to facilitate delivery of spot cargoes. However, the proportion of deliveries under long-term contracts to spot still remains heavily weighted towards long-term contracts. Following COVID-19, and given some of the difficulties we've discussed in terms of obtaining FM relief and indeed other forms of contract flex relief, I would expect to see buyers undertake a very serious strategic review of their long-term to spot portfolio mix. Look at it this way. If another COVID-style event happens in the future and buyers are again faced with demand destruction and lack of storage capacity, the cargo you don't buy is the cargo you don't need to take or pay for or argue about whether or not FM applies to it and you don't need to store it. So fewer firm cargoes under long-term SPAs and more flexibility to buy or not to buy spot cargoes would seem like a fairly straightforward self-help option for buyers, at least while the market remains a buyer's market. I'll talk a little bit later about what I see in terms of negotiation strategies for particular clauses in new LNG contracts. And in short, I think there will be a push for even greater flexibility in contract terms. But the second thing I'd like to discuss here is shorter contract durations. From the beginning of the LNG industry, when we saw 25 or 30-year contracts, we then moved to what became the more typical 20-year contract term, and are now seeing shorter contract periods as well. In terms of managing risk from a buyer's perspective, if you have a large number of shorter duration contracts, and those shorter duration contracts also have greater flexibility built into them, then combine that with an increased exposure to spot cargoes, and you have a very flexible portfolio that would hopefully enable you to turn down purchases under the spot element of your portfolio and exercise DQT, cancellation, and other rights across the larger portfolio of shorter duration contracts. Good for buyers, but no doubt a headache for sellers, particularly new market entrants looking to underpin their projects with long-term contracts. Thanks, Dave. Back to you.
Thank you, Michael. I think you're dead on about that, and just this trend toward a more tradable, shorter-term market does seem to be accelerating. Nick, coming to you again, with this degree of change having to be accommodated, what factors are going to drive the commercial and contractual dialogue over the next few months?
Thanks, Steve. Well, I think one of the biggest questions for the industry right now is when will some semblance of stability return to the global gas sector? And when that happens, where will prices stabilize? That's one of the biggest questions we're helping our clients with right now. It's relevant to buyers and sellers, upstream producers, lenders, and of course it's also very relevant in any kind of dispute or litigation that the current situation may create. One of the biggest drivers for those answers is what happens right here in the US. With the US likely to remain the marginal source of LNG globally for the next decade or more, the economics of US LNG will strongly influence landed prices, whether in Asia or Europe, and therefore the place to be for many of the projects around the world. While there are some projects or expansion of different existing trains that we know that can beat US economics, there are others, including some of the emerging projects in Asia, West and East Africa, where the pricing point measured against US projects is very close indeed. So let's take a look at that in more detail. It's easy to forget that for all the talk about Permian associated gas, somebody somewhere in the US has to be producing dry gas to balance the daily demand on America's gas network, which is around 100 BCF per day. Now, as some of you will remember, before the excitement about tight oil, shale gas was the talk of the gas sector, and huge amounts of capital were deployed in drilling unconventional basins such as the Marcellus and the Utica, and further south, the Haynesville, and of course the father of the shale gas revolution, the Barnett. Prices have been so low for so long, it's easy to forget that so much of that investment was made in a gas price environment of $4 per MMBTU, or actually quite a bit more, where returns are respectable and drilling and completion costs were fully supported. As prices have eroded, so technology has helped dry gas developers improve efficiencies and productivity. But for some time now, returns on dry gas development have been subpar. A glance at the share price performance of some of those players is enough to underline that. But as Gabe mentioned earlier, things are already starting to reverse. Another more tangible indication that investors have been deploying capital elsewhere is the rig count, with the number of natural gas rigs deployed in the US having fallen considerably over the last 15 months. So the big question for the gas industry, and in fact a question LNG buyers all around the world should be asking, is what level of wholesale gas pricing is needed to provide a sustainable investment base to incentivize dry gas production. For LNG buyers, the question is the same, but the rationale for asking it is different. The way in which US LNG terminals are structured varies, but for the most part, many of the buyers involved are exposed to Henry Hub risk. And one of the few ways of hedging that risk reliably is to invest in gas in the ground. It doesn't have to be the gas that's actually feeding the plant, but simply any resource in the US or indeed Canada whose value is more or less related to wholesale gas prices. For some time now, seller and buyer expectations have been somewhat at odds, but in the current environment, there's an opportunity for well-capitalized foreign players, in particular LNG buyers, to lock in very low feedstock for their LNG. How quickly sufficient confidence returns to prompt investors to make those long-term bets remains to be seen. But if they wait too long and wholesale prices and the forward curve starts to recover, the moment will be lost. And of course, if long-term LNG stakeholders fail to take the opportunity, there are many hedge funds and other entrepreneurial and well-capitalized players here in the US who will, armed with a solid appraisal of technical and commercial risk that will drive that point where prices reach equilibrium with sustainable investment. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Steve.
Nick, thank you very much. There's a lot of food for thought there, and including the point about the sort of natural hedge associated with having gas on the ground. So, Gabe, let's drill down a bit on this. What are some of the key issues to consider in structuring U.S. gas to LNG transactions?
Steve, one of the first issues to consider when structuring a gas to LNG transaction, and this is really a uniquely American issue, should be royalty litigation risk. While the method by which oil and gas royalty payments are calculated is often a contested issue, with LNG, the risks are more substantial because the value chain costs are so large in comparison to the underlying value of the gas molecules. So it is important to note that royalty clauses vary greatly across the U.S. upstream industry, with many written prior to the advent of LNG and thus without any consideration given to LNG. Therefore, the underlying leases from which gas is delivered for LNG liquefaction need to be carefully examined to determine, one, is the lessor entitled to be paid based on a wellhead price, LNG price, or perhaps even a power price in a foreign market where its gas is shipped. Two, from a lessee perspective, does the lessee have the right to deduct costs arising in the value chain? For example, in a transaction where the LNG buyer is an affiliate of the owner of the upstream gas assets, the transaction may incur increased scrutiny as costs incurred by affiliates under many leases cannot be deducted or are otherwise subject to a higher standard of review. Aggressive lessors may attempt to argue that valuation should occur as far downstream as possible, with as few deductions as possible. The U.S. government, as a lessor of gas fields in Alaska connected to the Kenai LNG terminal, took this stance in the dispute in the 1980s, arguing royalties needed to be paid based on the price of LNG shipped from Alaska to Japan. So if, for example, royalties need to be paid on a higher global LNG price and some or all of the value chain costs, such as G&P, transportation, and liquefaction, cannot be deducted, then a U.S. gas to LNG transaction could become uneconomic. So here is a sample royalty provision from a lease that would concern us. The first part, 3/16 of the gross proceeds received in the manufacture of products therefrom. Does that mean LNG? We have little guidance from any courts on this issue yet. The next part of the lease, that the lessee cannot deduct transportation costs, is equally troubling from a lessee perspective. Does this language mean cost to transport LNG cannot be deducted? Does this also mean the lessor is not required to pay its pro rata share of liquefaction costs and the lessee must absorb those costs? So whether you are an existing LNG buyer seeking now to hedge Henry Hub exposure through the acquisition of upstream assets or a new entrant to the U.S. gas to LNG trade, the key takeaway is to carefully review your leases and consider how you might best arrange the transaction to attempt to minimize royalty litigation risk. For example, one approach may be for the upstream co to not sell gas directly to its affiliated LNG feed gas supply co, but rather to sell its production to third parties and utilize a separate marketing sub to acquire the necessary feed gas for the LNG project. Now, for new entrants, they must also consider whether the tolling or integrated model is the appropriate structure for their gas to LNG transaction. Under the tolling model, an LNG buyer might first execute a liquefaction tolling agreement and then negotiate a separate upstream asset transaction and pipeline TSA, whereas under the integrated model, all of the moving parts in the value chain may be housed under one roof, and the participants share common ownership or rights over the upstream assets, liquefaction terminal, pipelines, and or marketing assets. While some LNG buyers may view a tolling arrangement as more attractive as the customer will be free to negotiate its own feed gas and pipeline arrangements, and the tolling structure can better protect against royalty claims, minimizing gaps in risk among the various agreements necessary to structure the gas to LNG transaction can be challenging, primarily because the LNG buyer will be negotiating with various counterparties without a common stake in the overall gas to LNG project. In addition, under the tolling model, where a project owner has reserved capacity in its terminal to market its own LNG, and its marketing affiliate is thus competing with the tolling customers, for example, over dock space or spot cargo trading opportunities, there's a greater potential for misalignment and disputes. Alternatively, some will contend that the integrated model overcomes the inherent problems in tolling by creating a greater unity of interest among all participants in the value chain, and thus risk allocation is more easily handled because all participants share in the risk and there's less competitive tension among off-takers. So also note that in general, U.S. gas producers appear to remain eager to gain exposure to LNG because as they see it, over the long run, having access to multiple gas sales points around the globe rather than selling all production at a U.S. wellhead price will help to reduce risk through diversification and improve risk-adjusted returns. So we continue to see opportunities for LNG buyers to structure interesting U.S. gas to LNG transactions. Over to you, Steve.
Gabe, thank you. We really are seeing more U.S. producers wanting to participate, what I call synthetically, in the LNG markets. In other words, where they do not own an ownership interest, but they do want to participate in the upside. And so these cautionary notes are important, as is the focus on the future and the long term, not just the current short-term issues. So that's looking at the U.S. Now, Michael, let's turn to Asia and look ahead to the future there. What do you think the implications will be on LNG markets in Asia in terms of LNG disputes and new contract negotiation?
Thanks, Steve. Despite many Asian buyers being averse to disputes generally, I think that it's inevitable that there will be disputes arising from COVID-19. I expect that the disputes will be in two main areas. The first area is FM claims, and in particular, the issue of whether the relevant event is actually a force majeure event for the purpose of the relevant contract. The second area is price reviews. Even prior to COVID-19, increasing numbers of buyers were discussing or indeed formally triggering price review processes. And while price review arbitrations have been rare, in 2018, KOGAS of Korea commenced arbitration against the Northwest Shelf LNG project in Australia in relation to a price review. And in 2019, Osaka Gas commenced a price review arbitration against the PNG LNG project. In the aftermath of COVID-19, I expect that the imperative to trigger price review clauses will only increase. So, given what I think is the inevitability of such disputes, I'd like to take a few moments just to give a few practical suggestions for prosecuting or defending claims successfully. The first is analyze the details of the arbitration clause closely. Like FM clauses, there are no standard forms of arbitration clauses, and failing to adhere to the process requirements of the clause can result in denial of rights. And I will, when I'm talking about disputes here, just focus purely on arbitration. The second is to try and optimize and maintain legal professional privilege. The starting point in approaching privilege is to assume that all documents and correspondence relating to the arbitration will have to be disclosed. So, where possible, do not produce any documents or correspondence unless done through your in-house or external legal advisors in accordance with protocols that you discuss with them in advance. The third is secure the right expert or experts for the dispute. Expert evidence is often critical in arbitration, so getting the right experts matters. Even if formal notice of a dispute has not yet been given, where there is potential for this to occur, parties should be considering who the best experts are for the dispute and approaching them in advance to secure their services, even if on an advisory basis, well in advance of any dispute, just in order to ensure that they're secured for future use. I'd like to turn now to new contract negotiation in the LNG space. For a number of years prior to the COVID-19 virus, the LNG market has been a buyer's market, particularly for good credit-rated buyers. And compared to 10 years ago, there are far more favorable terms to be had regarding things like destination cargo flexibility, cancellation rights, UQT, DQT, and so on. In what I expect will be the lower prices for longer environment we are entering following COVID-19, I expect that buyers will be seeking additional contract flexibility. And there are a few areas here where I would expect to see spirited dialogue at the very least. The first is in relation to force majeure clauses. From a buyer perspective, particularly a DES buyer perspective, I believe that buyers will need to consider how to avoid a situation similar to COVID-19 in the future. As I mentioned earlier in relation to force majeure, there are difficulties with claiming FM on downstream issues such as local market demand collapse, and then the inability to clear storage tanks as a result. So I would not be surprised if buyers seek to have FM apply in these types of circumstances in the future. The second is cancellation rights that Gabe's already referred to. Given the impact of COVID-19, I would look for buyers to seek greater flexibility in cargo cancellation, whether in terms of number of cancellations permitted in a defined period of time or over the life of the contract, or flexibility in terms of shorter notice required for cancellation. The third thing I wouldn't be surprised to see is greater flexibility around deferral rights, whether through expanded DQT arrangements or shorter notice periods for the renegotiation of delivery schedules. The fourth area where I would expect to see discussion is in price review clauses. Here I would expect to see buyers wanting shorter periods between reviews in order to minimize the risk of being caught in unprofitable positions. This was probably the case already. It was already on the cards rather before COVID-19, but I expect to see it more now, and particularly so if some of the other kinds of flexibility I've mentioned can't be incorporated into the contracts. Whatever the ultimate negotiated positions that are achieved by buyers and sellers in new contracts following COVID-19, I think that one thing is certain, and that is that some of these things are going to change as buyers push sellers to rebalance risk allocation in a post-COVID world. Thanks, Steve. Over to you.
Thank you, Michael. These are really great thoughts, and certainly not limited to Asia. And so we'll see how this all changes. So Ashish, pull out your crystal ball and give one of those predictions that Nick mentioned a while ago. As a result of all of this, how do you think the market could look in a year from now?
Hi, Steve. It's good you asked that because it is very easy to get preoccupied with the current state of the market. But as we have seen time and again in this industry, it is important to be able to identify trends and be proactive. We are beginning to see some revival in the markets as lockdown restrictions are slowly eased in some key countries. That said, it will not be surprising if there is some long-term demand destruction with change in lifestyles and some industries like airlines and cruises, which will take a lot longer to get back to their earlier levels of activity. With power being the major market segment for LNG, the impact on its demand levels is expected to be relatively lesser. Moreover, we expect that in the coming years, there will be greater penetration in developing economies of South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with fuel substitutions in favor of natural gas, and even just greater electrification to address power shortages across the population. As an example, in India, which will soon become the most populated country in the world, a major hurdle for growth in gas demand has been the shortage in downstream infrastructure. As a contrast, while the US consumes around 30 trillion cubic feet of gas per year, India only consumes around 2 trillion cubic feet, in spite of having 4 times more the population. Other than the western and northwestern parts and a few other areas, most of the country lacks the pipeline networks for access to gas. The government has now started implementing a $60 billion pipeline expansion program across the country over the next 5 years, which it hopes will address the connectivity issue. In addition, more than 150 city gas distribution licenses have been awarded in the last couple of years, which will provide CNG for vehicles and pipe gas to residential and commercial customers across the country. With these boosts to the infrastructure, we expect LNG imports to grow significantly in India over the next decade. Similarly, there are initiatives in other developing economies globally, driven by the governments and various multilateral agencies, which will lead to continued growth in LNG demand. Now turning to the supply side, I would like to bring up this chart, which compares the total capacities of new LNG supply that have come online over the last 3 years with the amounts that are expected to come online over the next 3 years. It's really a story of two halves, isn't it? While we've seen more than 80 MTPA of LNG capacity start up from 2018 to 2020, which has led to this huge supply overhang that we see in the market today, the new supply coming online over the next 3 years is expected to be 5 times lesser. We see this contrast due to 2 reasons. One, 2020 will largely culminate the first US wave, so to say, which has accounted for a majority of the new LNG supply over the last 3 years. And 2, from 2015 to 2017, very few projects took FID with low commodity prices that prevailed at the time. And this will imply lesser startups in the coming 3 years. Now, coupling this trend with the earlier observations that there could be delays at projects that are under construction and that there are likely to be lesser standing pre-FID projects a year or so from now, we might be looking at a market that will be coming back to some sort of balance. Over to you, Steve.
Ashish, thank you very much. We can look forward to some of that balance. This is great detail. I particularly enjoy the comments about India. I've been going to India for over 40 years now. It's really a remarkable place with lots of potential. So let's do a final round of comments here from each of our speakers. And Nick, let's start with you. Coming back to some of those introductory comments and notes of optimism to carry us through these challenging times, what thoughts would you like to leave with the audience today?
Thanks, Steve. Yes, very much so. And really, for obvious reasons, many companies are very focused on the immediate challenges of the sector. But one of the themes, I think, that will regain momentum very quickly is the role that gas will play in decarbonization and the energy transition. Now, I mentioned earlier that at least $300 billion worth of investment per annum is required for gas during the latter part of this decade, even with the highest estimates of renewable penetration in the energy mix. Beyond that, however, the fundamentals driving gas as a feedstock for hydrogen are exceptionally strong right now, with 2 or 3 technologies vying for position. With all the other demands on electrification, a gas-based hydrogen economy has more and more support by the day compared to other routes like electrolysis, for example. And certainly if I was starting my career again today, gas to hydrogen would be my chosen area to specialize in. There's no doubt about that. And who knows, maybe some of the big LNG projects that are delaying their FIDs that we talked about today might one day reemerge, not as an LNG project, but as a liquid hydrogen exporter. We shall see. Back to you, Steve.
Nick, you and I should start our careers over again. I think that'd be a whole lot of fun, so we'll look forward to that. Gabe, you next. What are some other challenges facing the LNG industry beyond COVID-19 that you're focused on?
Well, in the United States, it's presidential election season, and come November, depending upon the outcome of the election, the composition of commissioners at FERC may change. Currently, the lone Democratic commissioner has been opposing all new pipeline and LNG terminal permits on the grounds that FERC has not properly evaluated the environmental impacts or considered the consequences of its actions on climate change. If the Democrats were to win, then they would appoint a majority of the commissioners, and at a minimum, it'll take a lot longer for LNG terminals and associated pipelines to obtain FERC approvals. Many new projects will likely not be approved at all, and existing operating terminals will face greater scrutiny. In addition, LNG projects requiring financing may find it harder to arrange bankable projects as the LNG spot market continues to grow. And after the record-breaking oil and LNG price declines wrought by this crisis, LNG buyers will demand more flexibility and likely become even more adamant in rejecting the long-term take-or-pay agreements that LNG project lenders still require. Back to you, Steve.
Gabe, thank you. We have political risk all over the world, but we certainly have it here in the United States these days as well. So, Michael, coming back to you, Nick mentioned decarbonization in the hydrogen industry, and I know that's a particular area of focus for you. What would you like to share with us?
Thanks, Steve. And I'd just like to say that I agree with Nick wholeheartedly. Having been involved in one of the major development projects now for some time in the hydrogen sector, I think this is only going to become a bigger part of the future of energy. Look, the good news is that for now, natural gas and LNG are and will continue to be firmly part of the transition that Nick referred to. But emissions-free energy is the ultimate goal, and as such, renewable energy is a natural competitor to gas. And so the industry needs to think about how to be part of a future emissions-free energy world. And I do genuinely think that part of the answer is the emergence of the hydrogen economy. Hydrogen produced from natural gas reforming is the main source of hydrogen production today, but production by other means is being seriously considered, as Nick mentioned, things such as coal gasification and then refining to hydrogen and broadacre solar in conjunction with industrial-scale electrolysis. Enormous amounts of money are being spent globally to prove up supply chains, lower production costs, to develop liquefied hydrogen and transport technologies, and to expand demand. Hydrogen from gas allows producers also to diversify their product offering and produce a fuel that the world will increasingly want and that produces no emissions. There's a long way to go to get the production costs and demand equation where it needs to be, but the gas sector can be part of that and hopefully create some new markets that may help insulate it against a future COVID-style event as well. Thanks, Steve.
Michael, thank you. I've always felt that the energy industry is a technology industry, and we're really seeing that in all these developments that you mentioned. So, Ashish, close us out on this portion of the presentation. What are some final thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, as far as trends go, I would like to briefly note that smaller scale LNG solutions will continue to grow. They'll be driven by the need for break bulking and virtual pipeline networks on the demand side, as well as the relatively lower financing and bankability requirements on the supply side. But finally, looking back at the 2 decades I've been in the industry, the one takeaway I've had is that market tends to swing, and sometimes quite widely, between being a buyer's market and a seller's market. Every time people have thought it is the last of swings they've seen, the market has surprised them. This time too, at the risk of sounding like a contrarian, I would like to think that it will not disappoint. I'd like to leave with the thought that everyone should look at the best ways to adapt and minimize risks during this period, or even in some cases, capitalize on the current conditions and get themselves well prepared for the future, which could have some changed paradigms, as we have indicated through this discussion. Thank you very much for listening in, and we look forward to hearing your views. Back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Ashish. Another great final round of comments. We'll now transition to Q&A. Please give us a few moments, maybe up to 30 seconds, to compile the questions we've received, and we'll be right back. Thanks for your patience. We've gotten some great questions from the audience here. Congratulations on sending some good ones. We're running a bit longer than normal, but we'll go ahead and hit these questions, but we certainly understand that people need to drop. So I think the first one here, let's let Michael and perhaps Nick address it. And it is, what is the win-win solution for buyers requesting price review to reduce the price and for the sellers to maintain the economics of LNG sales?
Well, thanks, Steve. It's Michael. I might start. The first point I'd make is that if you're looking for a price review clause to give a lower price in the current COVID environment, then you'll likely need to be quite lucky in that the contract will normally determine when the review can occur. And if the review is triggered by time, for example, that you can undertake the review at periodic intervals during the term, then you'd need to be in the review window for the review to take place. The review process itself is often quite lengthy, so don't look for the clause to give immediate relief, but rather look for being able to capture some form of cost reduction for future cargoes. The second point I'd make is that price review clauses like FM clauses and arbitration clauses aren't standard form clauses, and as Gabe mentioned, range from having loose obligations to try to arrive at a new price to very prescriptive processes. The first thing to remember, though, is you need to follow the process set out in the contract, and that will really determine where you end up in terms of price. I should make the point, though, that at least from a buyer's perspective, I don't really believe that buyers are looking for a win-win in these types of clauses. In a market where their contract price is out of the money relative to the market, they're really looking for price relief. They're looking for a better price. The best thing to have is a certain clause that clearly sets out the obligations and then follow the clause provisions in good faith. If you have a clause, however, that includes a cap and a collar, minimize either party being too badly impacted by the price review, then that's probably, I think, the closest that I think you could get to a win-win. But then that really depends on the clause. Alternatively, in a contract that has a loose process, you could try and negotiate some additional benefit for one of the parties. So, for example, if the buyer is looking for the price reduction, then maybe the buyer could look at offering an extended price term. Although whether or not that is something which is of benefit to the seller really depends on the seller's view of the long-term market price for LNG. It's a difficult question, but again, it really comes down to where you get to in what's in your contract clause. Maybe, Nick, you've got some other observations there. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And, just picking up some of your comments, I actually really like the way the question was phrased in terms of a win-win. As you say, in the current skewed environment, it might be seen as a kind of a win-lose, and sometimes that price reopening dialogue is viewed a bit much that way. But really, in my book, anything that creates a more balanced contractual equation, really it always helps to create long-term stability, which is something in something as durable and financially important as an LNG contract is absolutely key, of course. So the problem has been, though, that for quite a few years in the global market for gas, buyers and sellers have been struggling really to find a workable substitute for the old methodology, if you like, of oil indexation. Even with the S-curve methodology that's supposed to protect both the buyer and seller from extremes. Now, it's interesting, in Europe, we kind of went through this process of price reform probably around 10 years ago now, with the process of, quite a few arbitrations and price review and resetting mechanisms. But with that, the results are very positive. It created a much more stable market. It's created a platform for growth and sort of sustainability. And with everything that's been happening lately, of course, I think we'll see some very significant moves now in Asia, particularly to find new ways to get LNG price that reflects a more sustainable investment environment. I think with, the good thing is with so many reliable wholesale gas indices now in existence, not just in the US, but starting to be possible to draw upon these elsewhere in Europe and parts of Asia, India, etc. The implications of using those and sort of, adjusting them with different freight or shipping costs to arrive at a kind of clearing price. That's the sort of approach we're seeing with a lot of our clients, and one which I think will create a much more sustainable price environment. So back to you, Steve.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. I think those are really good thoughts. I'll stand by my earlier comment that price review clauses are really hard to implement, and but they are part of the landscape. So, Gabe, here's another good question. We'll let you hit this one. What is the trend on U.S. oilfield service industry? Yeah, are capex to drill and complete going to come further down?
So for the oilfield services industry, it's really no longer about navigating this downturn. It's really about survival. CapEx for E&P companies in the U.S. is going to likely drop close to 70 to 80% compared to 2019 levels. And that's on the basis of a base case of $30 to $35 a barrel. It's not clear we're going to be able to sustain those price levels in any event. So the oilfield service industry is certainly feeling the impact. Plus, you have producers now that are really becoming increasingly efficient and cost-conscious, which is further impacting the oilfield service business. We also expect a good number of E&Ps, in order to survive this downturn, to have to merge, which would also be another negative for oilfield service providers. And they're just, they've got significant supplies of fracking gear, and that's just going unused. The demand is not there for those services. So it's going to be a tough environment, and prices will drop, which is good for E&Ps that are able to survive this downturn, but not so good for the OFS industry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabe. I think you're right. We're going to see more consolidation and contraction in the industry. And what that may have in terms of fewer providers may also tend in the other direction to have some ultimate effect of raising prices. So let's see. Here's another one. Ashish, perhaps you can help us with this one. How do you think the trend towards shorter-term SPAs will affect the development of new projects if the guaranteed revenue stream that longer-term SPAs offer isn't available?
Hi, Steve. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good question because obviously in recent years there's been a clear trend towards shorter-term SPAs, and it's primarily, if you look back, it's primarily driven by the fact that a significant amount of volume that's been developed through these projects and off-taken has been by the large majors and portfolio players and traders. And here I'm including some of the integrated developments as well as the U.S. projects as well, where a significant amount of volume was taken by portfolio players and traders. In that case, what has happened is they have at that point of time taken it on their balance sheets in terms of the financing, convinced the financing community about the fact that they have the wherewithal to develop and get these volumes into their portfolio and be able to send it to the ultimate markets at reasonable prices. So that's typically how we see these portfolio players have been able to hence because they're not directly linking a project to a certain customer, they've been able to have shorter term SPAs as required by the buyers from point to point in recent years. But I think with the low commodity prices that we see now, we will certainly continue to see some of these developments, no doubt, because some of the portfolio players who are, believing in gas playing a prominent role would certainly like to develop these projects and get more LNG into their portfolio. But I think in the current commodity price environment, and if it stays low for a longer time, I think the appetite for some of these majors and portfolio players would be lesser to develop these kinds of integrated developments, especially as you would know, they cost upwards of $30 to $40 billion. So I think there's a limit on how much they would be willing to finance and how much the banking community would be willing to see as purely a portfolio sale rather than sale to end customers.
Yeah, thank you, Ashish. I agree with those comments. I think we're definitely in an area that is continuing to evolve, and there will be lots of new potential structures, but exactly what's going to settle in is certainly not known yet. Let's take one more here, and perhaps Nick, you can go ahead and hit this, and Michael, if you have any comments, you're welcome to add them too. And the question is, what would be a long-term SPA price formula? One, linked to Brent, then in that case, what is the range of the slope? Or two, linked to even JKM, although it's a long-term SPA. Nick?
Yeah, that's a really good question in the current environment, and one which a lot of LNG buyers obviously asking themselves. My general comment would be that oil is, I think, going to be more and more the outlier in LNG long-term indexation. I mean, already you can see the presence of oil indexation drifting away from other forms of price formula. I mean, part of the reason for that is this the erosion, in terms of slope, if you like. For many, many years we were stable around the sort of 13-14% Brent, long-term price for LNG. Starting in about 2010, 11, we started to see that erode. And lately it's been at around a kind of if you look at spot prices versus oil, you're looking at about a 9%-ish correlation. And actually it's been, obviously quite a bit less than that lately. So I think if, the name of the game, if you're a big LNG buyer, in this period of price uncertainty, I think, sort sort of diversity of indexation is really one of the best risk mitigation strategies, where you choose one contract on one index and another with a different one. But longer term, one of the very interesting features that the flow of LNG around the world is doing is that JKM, TTF, Henry Hub, all these gas indices are correlating more and more together, because there's enough LNG flowing around to kind of really dampen down any arbitrage, before it really takes hold, unlike the old days. So I think that the short answer is, oil will gradually fade into the distance, and gas indices like JKM and others will come to the forefront. So with that, I'll pass it back for any more legal observations.
Thanks, Nick. Actually, I don't have a legal observation, but I do have a question, which is, are we going to actually see a convergence of some of these indices and convergence of pricing more broadly?
I think we are, yes. And there are two things helping that. One, as I say, is just and really this has been part of the byproduct of all this US LNG flowing around. It is so globally mobile, and the people behind the industry are very entrepreneurial people, bringing in a whole new perspective really to what's been a much more traditional LNG industry up till now. So for that reason, we're seeing a lot more correlation. And the other factor is that with the financial markets becoming more sophisticated, it's now possible to hedge basis differential between, whether it be JKM and Henry Hub and NTB, TTF, etc. So that also will create a kind of a coalescing around a reasonably standard range of global price, which will depend on where it's delivered because of the freight, but ultimately it will be highly correlated.
Yeah, no, I think it does, and I think that all makes a whole lot of sense. The ability to hedge is going to be key, so we have to keep developing those opportunities. So let's wrap it up with that. Once again, today's CLE code is AG0521, AG0521, and please fill out the CLE affirmation form that was linked in the 2-hour reminder email and send it through to Joyce Caballero with Aiken Gompt, and her email address is noted there. We will post a recording of today's presentation to Aiken Gompt's Speaking Energy blog, and it will also be included in Gaffney Klein's Energy Insights publication, which, by the way, I find very helpful. Finally, for any members of the media in attendance, a reminder that the content discussed in this program is strictly off the record. And lastly, want to thank all the attendees for coming, thank all the speakers for their time that they put into this and the excellent content, and once again express our appreciation for being able to do this jointly with Gaffney Klein. We'll leave it there. Thanks again, everybody. Bye now.